Even at Florence, they're basically arguing, well, what were the Cappadocians saying?
Yeah. Here's my view on Gregory of Nyssa, like from a just kind of scholarly perspective. Here's kind of the tension, right? When Gregory of Nyssa talks about the hypostatic properties explicitly, he says they are simple and unshareable. So he says that the ousia, the divine nature or essence, is shared. All the persons have the divine nature equally. The hypostatic properties are simple and unshareable. So, and that's important, right? So on the one hand, they're unshareable, right? So if the Father has fatherhood, the Son doesn't, the Holy Spirit doesn't. If the Spirit proceeds, then the Father and the Son don't proceed. But also, he says they're simple. So you can't say, if you said they weren't simple, they're the idiomata are just unshareable. Someone might make the argument, well, the Father's hypostatic property is a conjunction of, begetting but being unbegotten, and spirating and not being spirated, right? And all of that together is what distinguishes him. And then the Son, is begotten, but he spirates the Spirit too, and is not spirit. And then the Spirit is spirated, but doesn't beget, and is, so you might say, oh, well, that's fine. They can kind of share some things, but it's like the whole big package is unshareable. But that's not what Gregory of Nyssa says. He says they're simple and unshareable. So in his explicit statement, it's not like you can chop up the Father's idioma into parts and share a part of it, which as long as you don't share all of it, it's simple and unshareable. So and then elsewhere he says, when it comes to the ousia, they've got the whole ousia in common, but he says when we're talking about the idiomata, the hypostatic properties, he says the persons of the Trinity have nothing in common with respect to the idiomata. Nothing in common. Right.
So that would, it'd be that's pretty strong language for for anybody who would try to deny the Father as the sole cause and say, well, but there's also this other kind of co-cause.
So that's one sort of piece to the puzzle, is that if you're looking at his explicit statements about his metaphysics, it looks like there's just no way to reconcile that with the Filioque. Anyway, not any straightforward, obvious way to reconcile it with the Filioque. The thing that makes it puzzling and weird is that then he also will say things, he'll give metaphors and analogies and things that do look sort of like the Filioque or like some kind of Beau style thing or whatever. So like he gives the analogy of like you've got a torch that's just always been burning or whatever, and then you've got a second torch that's lit off the first, and then a third torch that's lit off the second.
Yeah.
So that looks like, that looks like, okay, the Father begets the Son, and then it's really the Spirit proceeds from the Son really immediately, but you could sort of look at it as ultimately from the Father or something like that. And so then that looks like, well, then it's kind of, what is that? From the Father through the Son, or what's going on with that? And so that's what makes it kind of difficult, I think, to interpret him, is because he's got explicit statements that just look like it's not going to work with the Filioque, and then he's got analogies that are kind of like, well, how does that fit? So I think really the interpretation about energetic processions, like that's a pretty good way to solve that puzzle, because otherwise you're just kind of left looking at it like, what is this? How does this work?
Well, this is important because, and I'd like to get your comment on this, not just with Nyssa, but the other Cappadocians as well, is that a lot of times when Roman Catholics approach the issue, they're really just kind of going through Contra Eunomius, looking for a few quote mines or a few things that would support the position via analogies. But the problem is that when you read the totality of the works, you realize, for example, in St. Gregory of Nyssa's against Eunomius, he's also pointing out that the Son cannot be a work of the Father because he shares the same energies as the Father. So in other words, the essence-energy distinction is here, and the essence-energy distinction is fundamental, again, not just to Nyssa's contra eunomius, but also to Basil's contra eunomius, as well as Basil's on the Holy Spirit. The operations of the energies are constantly used as a kind of argument. Basil says, for example, if the Holy Spirit has all the same energies as the Father and the Son, then he must therefore share the same nature, because energy is the manifestation or proceeds from the nature that has that energy. So, in other words, essence energy distinction is so fundamental to Cappadocians, all three of them, that it's really it's not only a question of are there a few quotes in Nyssa that might sound like Filioque. It's that the theology as a whole is bound up with not just hypostatic properties and Father as sole fount, but also essence energy distinction.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree, and it's one of these things where I really do feel like that there are Roman Catholics that want to interpret Basil and Nyssa as like not making the essence energy distinction, and I just think like that's just, I mean, like they feel like maybe they have to make it work with their theology or whatever, but I just think it's very clear. Like it's just it seems very clear. Like, and the reason, if you put it into the context of the argument, again, just think about this. Eunomius's argument is like premise one, absolute divine simplicity. Like everything we predicate about God is just a predication of God's essence. There's no energies, there's no access, it just all has to be different ways of getting at the divine nature, which is frankly, at least as I understand Aquinas, like sounds a lot.
Yeah, when it comes to the attributes, yeah. So Aquinas says there is a real distinction in the strongest possible terms in his theology between the persons. There's not a real distinction between the attributes compared amongst themselves.
Yeah, right.
And he also says there's not a real distinction between nature and person. So that would fall into
that's right.
That's the big problem.
I hang up the phone and go. Yeah, I've never. I mean, I don't like. I don't want to accuse someone like Thomas Aquinas of just being an idiot and crazy or something. But I'm sure there's a way to make sense of that.
Well, to me, it seems like there is competing things going on. Like there's this Aquinas that is saying correct things, over here. But then there's another Aquinas that's kind of like, but we've also got to make Augustinian ideas work. I've also got to, make these principles of, actually it's Neoplatonic ideas of simplicity. I've got to somehow make that work with, these other things and so that's my take on it, is that there's basically different Aquinuses.
Yeah. Well, that may be, I was saying, so with Eunomius's argument, right, it's kind of absolute divine simplicity is premise one. Premise two, we all acknowledge that the Father is unbegotten. Conclusion, unbegottenness is the divine nature.
Yeah.
Bam. So, and like Aquinas and others, I mean, maybe they have good responses or whatever, but the response that you get from the Cappadocians, from Basil, is Basil just ridicules the idea that everything we predicate about God.
Yeah, he just says that that's false from the outset, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what is Epistle 234 or whatever that
well, and he argues that distinctions don't entail composition or division. And they actually argue that if they did, then you couldn't predicate anything. They actually make a lot of the Palamite arguments before Palamas. That's why Palamas refers back to a lot of Cappadocian argumentation.
And Basil even, is pretty explicit. He says, there's a difference between the essence and the energies. And he says, you can't say that God's mercy and justice and his foreknowledge and his act of creation, all these things, he says, are all these just all names for the same thing? Like, that's crazy. And they're all really just the divine nature. And he says, no, they're all distinct from the divine nature. They're distinct from each other. So his response to the Eunomian argument is to give the essence energy distinction.
Right. I don't know if you've ever seen have you seen Aquinas's response to John Damascus on the essence energy distinction?
The one where he just says he's wrong.
Well, and he cites Maimonides. Yeah. He says, He says we can't posit a distinction between operation and essence because number one, that would mean that God has accidents, and then he says, and Maimonides has said, and he said, so it's basically, I'll just pull out Maimonides to. So in other words, he's citing Maimonides to reject John Damascus.